Today, I'll be making custom Magic the Gathering cards based on Fire Emblem Three Houses. And before I begin, I'd like to give a quick spoiler warning. I will be spoiling a good amount of this game, and I would recommend playing it before watching this video. Dimitri, Blue Lion, is a 2/2 legendary human noble that can be cast for green and a white. With Vigilance and other creatures you control get +1/+1. He can also be cast as Dimitri, Savage Boar, a 5/5 legendary human noble for 3 red, green, and a white, with Vigilance, Trample, and when Dimitri Savage Boar attacks, deal X damage to all creatures defending player's control, where X is Dimitri Savage Boar's power. My design for Dimitri was mainly based around his difference in character before and after the time skip. The front side of Dimitri represents him during the Academy arc, in which he's a lot more team-focused and less selfish, and genuinely wants to help his classmates and other people across Fodland. This is represented by how he's able to boost other creatures with his main ability, giving other creatures you control +1/+1. This is kind of similar to other effects like Maja, Glorious Anthem, and Benevolent Marshal. His backside, however, represents him post-time skip, where he's become increasingly selfish and bitter, as all he desires is to kill Edelgard. His ability on attack is essentially an Hour of Devastation on his stick, where he basically wipes the board whenever he attacks, showing his increased relentlessness and anger and destruction that he shows in his actions and combat throughout the later half of Three Houses. If you wanted to build Dimitri, I think his front side works incredibly well in a token deck, essentially another Anthem, which is always useful in those kinds of decks. His backside, however, is definitely more Voltron, where he benefits a lot from you boosting his power and also from getting extra combats. Edelgard, Future Emperor, is a 2/2 legendary human noble for red and a white with First Strike, and when Edelgard Future Emperor attacks, roll a d6. If the result is 6, Edelgard Future Emperor gains indestructible until end of turn. Or it can be cast as Edelgard Flame Emperor, a 6/6 legendary human noble for 3 red, white, and a black with First Strike. Whenever Edelgard Flame Emperor deals combat damage to an opponent or a creature an opponent controls, you may untap Edelgard Flame Emperor. If you do after this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase, and activate this ability only once each turn. And also, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, draw a card. The front side of Edelgard is mainly built around her crest. As you learn from doing her support chain, you learn that Edelgard also bears the Crest of Flames along with you. One interesting quirk about this crest is that it has the chance to completely stop enemy counterattacks. To represent this in Magic, I made it so when she attacks, there's a chance that she can gain indestructible until end of turn, effectively negating the counterattack. What I think is a bit more interesting, however, is her backside. Whenever she deals combat damage to a player, she gets a Seize the Day-esque effect. This is done to represent her unique combat skill, Raging Storm, which allows you to go again in Fire Emblem if you're able to land it. This ability is very powerful in Fire Emblem, and it's also very powerful here, essentially allowing you to attack with Edelgard twice in one turn, and of course to limit this ability, it's only able to activate once each turn, as to not allow Edelgard to take infinite combat steps. On top of this, her final ability whenever a non-token creature dies is a Grim Hyosphex Midnight Reaper-esque effect, where you benefit from sacrificing your own creatures. This is done to represent her ideology on war itself, that it's necessary to sacrifice people if you want to achieve the results that you want. So in this case, it's representing that you have to sacrifice your creatures in order to gain advantages where you need it. If you wanted to actually build her, obviously I think probably Voltron or Aristocrats is the way to go, with Mardu being a great idea for both strategies. Claude the Schemer is a 2/2 legendary human noble for green and a blue with Reach and blue and tap. Target creature gains Skulk until end of turn. Or it can be cast as Claude Alliance Unifier, a 7/7 human noble for 3 green, white, and a blue, with flying and pay 2 mana. Claude Alliance Unifier gains hexproof until end of turn, and Battalion. Whenever Claude Alliance Unifier and at least 2 other creatures attack, creatures you control gain unblockable until end of turn. In Three Houses, Claude is presented as the Schemer, an interesting tactician that brings a lot of unique ideas to combat. To represent this in Magic, I decided to give him a lot of unblockable-esque effects. The front side of his card represents him in the Academy phase of the game, and obviously because of this, he's less strong and less skilled than he will be later in his life. To represent his kind of interesting schemes in the Academy arc, I decided to make it so he can give creatures Skulk, which is a mechanic we don't really see that often. Essentially, it's kind of a weird version of Unblockable that's somewhat limited. I think that kind of quirky idea is what would represent a scheme that Claude would come up with very well. A non-conventional idea, but also highly effective in a lot of scenarios. And of course he is reached because he is obviously a archer. His backside, however, represents him in the war phase of the game, where he is the alliance leader. His reach goes from flying because now he actually has a wyvern to ride. His second ability, where he gains hexproof until end of turn, is represented by his unique combat art, Fallen Star, which allows him to avoid every attack that he's going to take for the rest of a turn. His final ability with the battalion is kind of an improved version of his original ability. Overall, I think Claude is an interesting build. I think where he's going to succeed a lot is using strategies that require your creatures to be unblockable. Felix Shield Successor is a legendary 3/2 Humanite for 1 red. With whenever Felix Shield Successor attacks alone, he gets +3/+0 until end of turn. And whenever Felix Shield Successor attacks, roll a d6. If the result is 6, he gets +3/+0 until end of turn. To represent Felix in Magic the Gathering, I based him mainly around his combat skills. In Three Houses, Felix has the skill Lone Wolf, which gives him a benefit for attacking without having a battalion equipped. It makes it so he does increased damage, so to represent in Magic, I made it so when he attacks alone, he gets this combat boost, essentially representing him attacking alone as not having a battalion. On top of this, he also has a crest ability, which makes it so he has the chance to randomly do an increased amount of damage whenever he attacks. To represent this random chance in Magic, I decided to use the dice rolling mechanic that we saw in the Forgotten Realms set, so whenever he gets a 6, he actually gets this combat boost. I think this represents Felix's combat abilities fairly well, and is a pretty good representation of him, mechanically speaking. If you wanted to use Felix, I would highly recommend running him with the Barbarian class, as it's going to make it so he has an increased chance to trigger that combat ability. On top of this, I do think what's worth mentioning is that Felix is a really strong early drop in a lot of metas. If you get lucky enough, this is essentially a 9/2 at 3 mana, which is kind of insane if you ask me. I think he might be a little bit pushed, but I do think it represents his abilities fairly well. The Gatekeeper is a legendary 0/6 human knight for 1 and a white with Defender. The Gatekeeper is a fun joke character they throw into the game that you can talk to whenever you're in the monastery phases. It has become a series favorite mainly based on his fun greeting and his lack of actual skill at gatekeeping. Considering he's a joke character and you don't actually use him in any combat instances, it's kind of hard to represent him in Magic. What I decided to do is base him off of his main occupation, which is protecting the gate at Garruk Mach. So in this case, he would be a defender, so he's not really out attacking. Now obviously, because he is a legendary creature, it does make sense that he should have a somewhat more powerful effect, considering you can only have one of him on the battlefield at a time. I decided to push his toughness further up a bit more, making him a 0/6 for 2 mana, which is honestly pretty good, especially in a limited situation. He's a really strong early game blocker if you really want to use him. Thunderstrike Catherine is a 4/2 legendary human knight for 3 white and red with Double Strike, Haste, and when Thunderstrike Catherine attacks or blocked alone, if a source would deal damage to Thunderstrike Catherine, it deals half that damage instead, rounded down. Catherine is the wielder of the all-famous Thunderbrand, a legendary hero's relic that is incredibly powerful and is shown even better through her combat skills. To represent her speed and strength in combat, I decided to give her Haste and Double Strike. On top of this, the rest of her card is built around her unique skill, Fighting Spirit. This skill makes it so she takes reduced damage whenever she does not have a battalion equipped, meaning she works better alone rather than using a battalion by itself. To represent this in Magic, I made it so whenever she attacks or blocks alone, she gets reduced damage done to her, similar to effects like Gisela, Blade of Gold Knight. I think if you wanted to build around her, I think the best way to go is probably a Voltron strategy, where you boost your power and take advantage of the Double Strike, and also the reduced damage she's going to take. Mercedes Benevolent Soul is a 1/1 legendary human cleric for 2 white with. If you would gain life, you gain twice that much life instead, and tap, target player gains 3 life. Mercedes is probably the most useful healer in the game. This is mainly due to her unique skill of Live to Serve, which makes it so whenever she heals an ally, she also heals that much life. To represent this idea of Live to Serve in Magic, I gave her a Boon Reflections-esque effect. So that way, whenever you gain life, you're also gaining the extra life that you gain from Mercedes on top of that. While the comparison necessarily isn't one-to-one, I think it represents the idea fairly well, considering there's no real way for creatures to restore life in Magic the Gathering. On top of that, I made it so she can gain players 3 life, kind of just as a generic healing effect, as she does have access to it. I think she works well in life gain decks, obviously, so stuff like Karlov the Ghost Council, Alora Aegis Insight, and Trelisaro the Moon Dancer. Any deck where you're running Boon Reflections, this is probably going to go great in. It's another redundant card for a very powerful ability. And that's all the cards I have for today. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.